Ever wonder why, some nations just seem to have it all while others struggle? Well, we're diving deep into why nations fail to hopefully get some answers.
Yeah, it's a fascinating read.
You sent over some really intriguing excerpts from Daron Acemoglu and Jim Robinson, and um, let me tell you, they really don't hold back when it comes to tackling this whole issue of global inequality.
No, they don't. It's a bold book for sure.
Yeah.
They confront those age-old questions about wealth disparity head on, you know,
Yeah.
and they use history as a lens to understand why some nations prosper while others, well, lag behind.
Yeah, and they start right off the bat, they hit us with this question that feels, I don't know, as relevant today as ever. Why are some nations so much richer than others?
And they bring it to life with a really powerful example, Egypt. Remember those protests in Tahrir Square? People were demanding social justice, but for many it went deeper than that. They saw their economic struggles as inseparable from their lack of political rights. And that connection, the link between political institutions and economic outcomes, that's at the core of the book's argument.
It's so easy to fall back on those, I don't know, those familiar explanations, right? Like, oh, maybe it's all about geography, a country's destiny is determined by its location, or certain cultures are just better suited for economic growth.
Right, those classic arguments.
But Asimoglu and Robinson, they kind of dismiss those ideas pretty quickly.
They do, and they present a really compelling case, backed by a ton of historical data. While factors like geography and culture might play a small role, they argue that they are not the primary drivers of national wealth.
Okay, so if it's not about the land itself or the people's cultural traits, what is it? What's that secret ingredient, that key factor that sets successful nations apart?
Well, Acemoglu and Robinson argue that it all boils down to institutions. But not just any institutions, they make a crucial distinction between inclusive and extractive ones. This is the core framework they build their entire argument on.
And this is where things start to get really interesting because they use the example of North and South Korea to illustrate this point, right?
Yeah, it's a stark example, but a powerful one. Same people, same culture, same geography even, but divided by a border and two vastly different institutional setups.
And the results speak for themselves.
They do. A teenager in North Korea faces a drastically different future than a teenager in South Korea. One marked by limited opportunities, strict control, while the other, they have access to education, to technology, the chance to build a brighter future. And what Acemoglu and Robinson are arguing is that these divergent paths, they're not some random occurrence, they're direct consequence of the different institutional paths these nations have taken.
But here's where it gets a bit nuanced, right? Because when they talk about inclusive institutions, it doesn't automatically mean democratic in that traditional sense. They bring up the example of Barbados, a nation built on a, well, let's face it, a brutal slave economy.
Right, and that's a really important point. Barbados, they had functioning courts, they enforced property rights, but these mechanisms, they only benefited a small elite, the plantation owners. The majority of the population, the enslaved Africans, they were entirely excluded from these systems.
So while Barbados might have had some features of what we might consider good institutions on the surface, they weren't truly inclusive. The system was rigged, designed to benefit a select few at the expense of the majority. It's like this constant push and pull, isn't it, between those in power wanting to maintain control, resisting change, and the need for societies to adapt, to evolve, to embrace new ideas. And this is where that concept of creative destruction comes in, right?
Yeah, it's a key idea in the book. Acemoglu and Robinson argue that innovation, while essential for long-term progress, can be incredibly disruptive, especially for those who benefit from the status quo.
It's like that saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs.
Exactly. And they use a fascinating historical example to illustrate this point. The story of William Lee and his invention, the stocking frame knitting machine.
Right. I remember reading about that. It was a revolutionary invention for its time, wasn't it?
It was. But here's the thing. When William Lee presented his invention to Queen Elizabeth I, you'd think she'd be over the moon, right? A new technology that could revolutionize England's textile industry.
Yeah, I think so.
But she wasn't. In fact, she refused to grant him a patent.
Why on earth not?
She was afraid. She recognized the potential economic benefits, of course, but she was more concerned with the potential social upheaval it could cause. All those skilled hand knitters suddenly out of work. It could lead to unrest, to instability.
So she prioritized maintaining the existing power structure over embracing a potentially disruptive innovation.
Precisely. And Acemoglu and Robinson argue that this fear of creative destruction, this resistance to new ideas that threaten the established order, It's been a recurring obstacle to progress throughout history. Societies need those fresh perspectives, those brave souls willing to challenge the status quo.
It's like they say, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down.
It's true, but those nails, those innovators, they're often the ones who drive progress. So the question becomes, how do you create a system that encourages those new ideas, that allows for a more equitable distribution of power and opportunity? And the book points to a pivotal moment in English history as a potential answer, the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Right, that was a major turning point, wasn't it?
It was. It marked a significant power shift away from the monarchy and towards parliament. It wasn't a clean break, of course, but it did lead to some crucial changes, particularly when it came to property rights.
And this emphasis on property rights, that was key to creating a more inclusive economic system. It seems like a subtle shift.
It was subtle, but incredibly powerful. When people have secure property rights, when they know that they own something outright and that those rights will be protected, it fundamentally changes their incentives. They're more likely to invest, to take risks, to innovate.
Because they know that they're the ones who will reap the rewards of their efforts, not the king, not some arbitrary authority.
Exactly. It's about aligning incentives with innovation. And this shift in England, it helped foster an environment where entrepreneurship could thrive, where new ideas were encouraged. And they used the story of James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine, to illustrate this point.
Right. He was working at the perfect time, wasn't he? A time when innovation was rewarded, when a skilled engineer could make his mark on the world.
Exactly. Watt was able to secure a patent for his steam engine, a form of legal protection that was becoming increasingly common in this new system. And that invention, fueled by a system that encouraged and protected innovation, went on to power the Industrial Revolution.
It's amazing how these seemingly small changes, like a shift in how property rights are protected, can have such a profound ripple effect on history.
It's true. But as Acemoglu and Robinson point out, the path to progress is rarely linear, and it's often fragile. Even when you manage to overthrow a bad leader or dismantle a corrupt regime, there's no guarantee of a happy ending.
Right, because power can be so easily consolidated again, even in the vacuum left by a fallen tyrant. And this is where they introduce that rather sobering concept, the iron law of oligarchy.
Exactly. It's this idea that even when you remove a dictator, a tyrannical regime, a new elite often emerges to take their place. The system of extraction of inequality often persists, just with new faces in charge.
It's like that old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Sadly, it's often true. And they use Sierra Leone as a powerful example of this.
Sierra Leone, after fighting for and winning its independence from British colonial rule, what happened there?
They cycled through a series of leaders, some of whom continued the extractive practices of the predecessors. They might have talked a good game about equality and progress, but in reality, their main goal was to enrich themselves and consolidate their own power.
It's a sad but familiar pattern, isn't it? The allure of power, the temptation to exploit a system for personal gain.
It's a constant temptation, and one that few leaders throughout history have been able to resist. And one of the most striking and disturbing examples from Sierra Leone's history is the story of Siaka Stevens. He was a leader who was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to maintain his grip on power, even if it meant sacrificing the well-being of his people.
What did he do?
Well, he became increasingly paranoid about opposition to his rule, particularly from a specific region within Sierra Leone. And so he made a chilling decision.
What was that?
He dismantled the railway line that served that region, just ripped it up.
He destroyed vital infrastructure just to stifle dissent.
He did. He calculated that by crippling the region's economy, he could also cripple their ability to challenge his authority. It's a stark illustration of how the fear of losing power can drive even the most ruthless and destructive actions.
It's a reminder that even after a nation achieves independence, even after it overthrows a tyrant, the struggle for genuine freedom and prosperity is never truly over.
Exactly. And it brings us to a major question that looms over this entire discussion, a question that Acemoglu and Robinson knew they had to address. China.
Yes, China. The elephant in the room. How do you reconcile this entire argument, this emphasis on the importance of inclusive institutions, with the undeniable economic success of an authoritarian state like China?
It's a million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we'll dig into more deeply after the break. Well, they jump right into it. They acknowledge it. China's economic growth over the past few decades, it's been staggering. You can't deny that. But they argue that it's a distinct kind of growth.
Okay, so what do they call it then, if it's so different?
Extractive growth.
Extractive growth. Okay, so even though they're experiencing this incredible boom, It's not sustainable, is that what they're saying? That it can't last.
That's the argument, and they back it up by pointing to, well, a number of factors. One of the big ones is forced labor. They talk about how China's economic engine is, in some ways, fueled by coercion, by a lack of respect for basic human rights.
So even if they're putting up impressive numbers in the short term, the foundation is shaky. It's like building a house on sand.
That's a good way to put it. And they also talk about the suppression of dissent. China's not exactly known for its tolerance of opposing viewpoints, right?
Right. It's a
Not
tightly controlled system.
exactly. And that lack of freedom, that suppression of ideas, it might not seem like a big deal in the short term, especially when the economy is booming, but over time, it stifles innovation. It creates a climate of fear where people are afraid to speak out, to challenge the status quo. And that, as Acemoglu and Robinson argue, is not a recipe for long-term success.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when you look at a country like China, it's tempting to just focus on those GDP numbers, the shiny new infrastructure. But this book really challenges us to look beyond those surface level indicators to consider the human cost of economic growth.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about this book. It gives us a framework for thinking critically about these issues. It's not just about celebrating success stories or condemning failures. It's about understanding the complex interplay of factors that contribute to a nation's trajectory.
And it's about asking tough questions. Questions about the trade-offs we're willing to make, the values we prioritize, the kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly. If a nation can achieve incredible economic growth, but it comes at the expense of individual liberty, of human rights, is that a trade-off we're comfortable with? These are questions that every society has to grapple with, and this book gives us the tools to engage in those conversations in a more informed and nuanced way.
It's been a fascinating deep dive. I always come away from these conversations feeling like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's been a pleasure.
And for everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this journey into the pages of Why Nations Fail. We hope it sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and maybe even inspired you to think differently about the world around us. Until next time.